what a perfect picture that God has cosmic rules in place. And he's not going to violate those rules, even if it means evil gets to triumph for a season. But ultimately, he is going to win. He is going to show himself glorious. He's going to let things play out. Evil and humanity in their rebellion, he's going to let it play out, because ultimately it's that contrast between good and evil that shows how good he is, that we probably wouldn't see without it. Welcome to the Days of Noah podcast, where we talk all things biblical, supernatural, and strange. This week we're going to be reviewing Blurry Creatures episode 137 on the Wandering Stars with Doug Van Dorn, and also getting into some of the ideas of counterfeit gods and how that plays out against the true God and his cosmic rules. All right, well, welcome back, guys. I'm glad we could get together on last day of the year, and we're going to be reviewing Blurry Creatures episode 137 with Doug Van Dorn, one of the show's favorite guests, one of my favorite guests, too. And he's going to be talking about wandering stars and kind of that idea of astrology versus kind of a biblical understanding of astrology versus it being like a false religion. And so just looking at Doug's profile, he's a pastor of a church, and his website, rbcnc.com, has tons of sermons and PDFs. Just his section on the book of Revelation alone has about 40 entries, PDFs to go with each sermon. So that would be really cool to check out. But also one of his books that I'm reading that I'm really enjoying is Giant Sons of the Gods. And I love how he gets into a lot of the giant tribes that the Nephilim infested tribes that Israel dealt with in the land of Canaan and surrounding areas, because it really answers some of the chief objections that atheists bring in, that God of the Bible is some genocidal maniac who's calling for the death of every last man, woman, and child. And if we can have an understanding that perhaps there's good evidence these tribes were infiltrated and infested with hybrid DNA, and it led to just incredible wickedness, we get a much better context for why God would call for the harem, the complete destruction of these tribes. But kind of the theme, I think, of the episode of Blurry Creatures is this idea again of counterfeit versus reality. I think of God creating something first, as Luke on the show, one of the hosts on the show, pointed out, and then it's kind of hijacked after that. Like the stars of the sky are meant to point to God; they're His angelic host. But to ancient pagans, they were the gods to be worshipped and to be controlled for their own uses. So, Don, what were some of the things that kind of stood out to you as you were listening to that episode?
Well, I listened to episode 137 two times as I wanted to kind of drink it in. I listened to it with some bit of caution, as whenever things start to go into zodiac or astrology, we even had some bath curtains that had all those, strange suns and moons on it. And I told my wife I didn't really care for it.
Right.
Now it's cool.
Yeah.
It's really cool. But to me, it was leaning into some sort of a zodiac kind of a situation that I've always been very cautious of. And then when I start thinking of that, I start thinking of tarot cards and all that stuff. So, so as I listened to it, I drank in what they were talking about. I guess the one thing I would say that stood out to me was an idea that came to my head, in that God does through the Bible have us look at the sky for signs. Says, when when to harvest the crops, when the weather's going to be good or bad, and things like that. So I think that there's something to it, but I also think that if God wanted us to be diving into the stars very deeply, he would have given us specific instructions to do so and specific guidelines for doing so. And that's where I kind of got a little bit, I wouldn't say weirded out, but I got a little bit more cautious as I listened.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think that's a good way to put it, because if you think about the difference of how someone who has no interest in God, who is trying to kind of find his own, whether it's New Age or predicting the future or some other way that God says don't mess with this stuff, they're doing so for their own purposes, to have their own control over situations. They're not doing so in order to honor God with it. And you're right, we don't get that kind of prescription from God. Here, I'm gonna lay things out in the heavens, and I want you to do this. Certainly there are times where signs in the heavens do mark certain events, as it seems with Revelation 12, the birth of the Messiah. But those are kind of sparse, right? They're kind of just speckled in certain places that God will do that. Not like, I want you to base your whole life on this, and this is going to map out your future, right? Is that kind of the distinction you noticed?
Yeah, I would say that the way that the zodiac works, and the way that at least from my understanding of it, is kind of occulty a little bit, and I do see that, like, to your point, God does not say prophecy from the stars, or I'm going to map out your life by the stars. But he does, to be fair to the topic, he does mention in different places of the Bible that there is a usefulness to us by being aware of what's going on up in the heavens.
Yeah, I heard it put this way. When you look at the verse in Genesis, he says, I'm making, let there be lights in the heavens, let them be for signs and for seasons. I heard someone put it this way: it's kind of God's billboard. And so there are occasions, I think, in history and perhaps in the future, where he does create certain events. It might be an eclipse, or a blood moon, or something like that. That may be surrounding a certain event or a change of a season in God's purposes. But yeah, I think we could get sucked into kind of looking at those too intently, or with selfish motivations, or trying to predict the future. As on the show they mentioned John Hagee's books on the blood moons about 10-15 years ago, and I have to admit I was into that at the time and thought, wow, what's going to happen next year or this year? And I don't know if there were some events tied to that people can prove or not, but as Doug says on the show, I think, fool me once, fool me twice, 150 times, he says, we can kind of get burnt by jumping into those.
Well, I think balance is a healthy thing, because you spoke it in the beginning about counterfeits. So there's things that God will use, and we're talking about the heavens, we're talking about the stars, the moons, the planets. God will use those things for signs and for seasons. It's plain in the scriptures. But the enemy will also twist that and counterfeit it or corrupt it for his evil intentions. Just like we know there's a true gospel, then there's all these counterfeit gospels. He'll take an element of truth and pollute it, and it will take you down a rabbit hole that's going to lead you away from Christ. So we have to have an element of balance with this, and that we're not putting all our hope, our trust, our insight, or the horoscope type of mindset, that is directing our steps versus what God is trying to lead us. Because, like we said last week, Pete, we were going through the biblical narrative of the Magi, the wise men, who are using the Bible, the prophecy, and also looking at the heavens to declare, hey, the Messiah is on the horizon. We're going to go find him. So they did use the scripture, and they used God's creation to lead them to the path of the gospel, honestly, because it's written in Luke. So I think we kind of need to look at it from, not dismiss, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater, and I think that's what Pastor Van Horn was trying to do. I think he was trying to have a balance with this, that, we're not 100% subscribing to astrology, but let's just kind of understand where they're coming from, because even the New Age movement will have a little bit of truth in it if we were to examine it. So I just wanted to add that point.
No, that's important. And one thing too that as I'm kind of reflecting back in my own life over this last year, just this understanding that Satan as the father of lies. Right, and one of the most potent types of lies is where it has an element of truth to it. But then, even on top of that, something, I believe, can be 100% true, an actual fact, actual reality, but still as dangerous as a lie if your focus is on it. If there's perhaps a larger truth, a bigger truth that is more important, and your focus and emphasis is on this smaller truth. So it may not even be a half-truth. It may be 100% real. I like to use this analogy, does a bulletproof vest offer protection? Yes. If you wear one and stand out in the highway, how protected are you? Not very much. So it's this idea that kind of a bigger truth swallows up a smaller truth. And I think it's in addition to outright lies, half-truths, but also full truths that Satan uses in order to kind of divert our attention. So kind of what we're talking about as we go through a lot of understanding of the ancients and how they were looking towards other gods and different things is that there was something there that was alluring and attractive. It wasn't all made up. And so some of the things that they did, again, we talked about it a little bit, was how they laid out their cities. But I just want to go through a few verses, kind of talking about how stars is used in the Bible. Because Luke, you remember? I think it was our second recording where I was talking about some of my coworkers' objections to the idea of sons of God, right?
Right.
Well, Doug on this episode brought up that same verse in Job, where God is saying to Job, where were you when I was laying the foundations of the earth and all these things that I did in creation? And my coworker had said, so that verse where it says, where were you when the morning stars sang together and all the sons of God shouted for joy? And so my coworker's position was, see, they're talking about stars, like actual lights in the sky. This is not some angel. And so he was taking both descriptions to mean like a physical star. And to Doug's point on the show, he says that's what's basically known as parallelism. So it's a grammatical thing that it was very common in Hebrew writing, where you say the same thing with two different words or verbiages. So morning stars, and then in the same sentence, sons of God. So they're actually combining those two concepts together and saying these are both, created beings. And then we have other language like in Psalm 148, praise him, sun, moon, and stars. And again, we can kind of, potentially think of that figuratively, but if you think of these things as possibly, his angelic host, then it makes a lot more sense that they could be literally praising, not just, like my coworker said, the stars praise God by shining their light, kind of metaphorical. And
he's not wrong, because
Yeah.
there is reference to creation groaning and creation praising, and even I think it was in the Gospels that he said, if you don't praise, even the rocks will cry out.
Yeah, so there's something
you have
to that.
You have to look at the context, and you got to look at it from both angles. Which noun are we looking at? Is this a created inanimate object, or is this something that is a son of God, a created being?
And a lot of times, as we've talked about, I think there's multiple layers of meanings in things that God says. Like they're just so, as Dr. Judd Burton would say, pregnant with all kinds of meaning. So sometimes there's multiple layers. And the late Chuck Missler said, I'm paraphrasing, but he said something like, the more he took the Bible literally, the more things just opened up for him that he didn't see before. So if we try to see how is there a possibility that maybe this is meant literally, not always, but sometimes we get multiple layers of things, of meanings. In Isaiah 14:33, I believe talking about Lucifer, you have said in your heart, I will ascend to heaven above the stars of God. So the way Doug takes this on the show is he says that's about ruling the divine council, not just being a part of it, but actually like, I will ascend above the stars of God doesn't just mean, oh, look at me, I'm higher than, than all these lights in the sky. Okay, yeah, that's nice. So you're sitting in a tall chair. Who cares? But it's actually meant like, I'm going to be exalted above my fellow divine council.
It was a position of authority. It was a ruling. It was being envious of a position of power. That's the way I understood it.
Yeah, that makes sense. In Matthew 24, Jesus is talking about after the tribulation, the stars will fall from heaven, and the powers of heaven will be shaken. So, and then I think in Revelation it talks about that too, or with the dragon, right? The stars being thrown down to earth and things like that. So, obviously, a physical star, if it is, and I have my doubts that it's what astronomers and astrophysicists say it is, because it's a light in the sky, and we can't touch it and put it in a test tube or anything. But if it is what they say it is, it's a burning ball of gas. Yeah, we got some major problems if that's getting hurled to the earth. So I think we have to take a different view, and the Bible has, like we're talking about, many instances where stars are referred to as beings, not just a non-sentient inanimate object kind of thing. One of the concepts too that Doug brought up was this idea of Eden, as Mike Heiser talks about, being the cosmic mountain of God, of paradise, and mountains also often associated with where the gods reside because it's hard to get to, so it's kind of separate from humanity, and that the Tower of Babel was kind of the counterfeit Eden, that that the people building the tower were trying to ascend to the gods, or counterfeit, or overthrow the true God. Just that some sense of recreating the cosmic mountain for their own purposes. And then we see that again with the structures that a lot of these societies have built. So in Egypt, the pyramids of Giza are actually laid out to emulate Orion's belt, the constellation Orion. You got serpent mounds. Doug mentioned one in Florida that's also built to mirror constellations in the sky over Florida. In Cambodia, there's a temple called Angkor Wat that is laid out according to the constellation Draco. And then they mentioned that 15-year-old Canadian teenager who discovered that Mayan cities were laid out exactly to the constellations over that part of the world. Or Cusco, the Incan capital. We talked about Cusco a little bit with the megaliths. They built that whole city in the shape of a puma. And you have the constellation Leo, like a lion, over that city.
So I would like to, add this. Obviously, you're naming all these examples, and electricity wasn't around. The light pollution that we have right now wasn't there. So they were able to see the heavens much more clearly than we are, and so it was used. It influenced them. It influenced them greatly, and it was their motivation to build all these structures. So it's good to understand their motivation and why they did these things and how it's tied together. I'd like to get back to what the pastor was referencing. How was he in this episode using astrology? What was his main point on bringing that up?
On how the ancients would have used astrology, or rather how biblically we should be using it.
I guess I'm trying to remember the episode and how he.
I think it was, again, this idea of counterfeit, but then also understanding why did they take, in some cases, decades to build these structures, to lay out these cities in this fashion. And so one point or question that the host Nate brought up was this idea that they were trying to connect with these gods, try to invite them, try to pay homage to them, invite their power for their own purposes. And Doug kind of answers that. He says, yes, 1,000% yes. That's what they were trying to do. So it's like, to Don, to your point about caution, as they were going full bore into, oh yeah, let me jump into this. I know these things are actual entities, and I want them to be a part of my life. I wanna interact with them, and these are the kinds of things God says, don't mess with it. Yeah, it might be real, but you're inviting things into your life that you don't have control over. Just like witchcraft and occult and Satanism, people are attracted to some of the power and that they can actually affect things. But you're inviting entities into your life that you can't control and don't have your best interest in mind. Instances, where they were trying to pay homage and invite these gods, trying to bring heaven to earth, and it's a counterfeit too. Like Doug brought up the Lord's Prayer. Thy will be done as on earth as it is in heaven. So kind of this idea of heaven and earth mirroring one another. There's something to that. But again, if your purpose is to kind of have the power in your own hands versus giving homage to the creator and not created things. I think that's kind of where the distinction comes in. And then we have, so I mentioned Cusco and Serpent Mounds. And then we also have, like, even in Washington, D.C., I think this would be an interesting episode to do in the future. Just how Washington, D.C. is laid out according to a lot of occultic, Masonic type of ways. Have you guys heard anything about some of that? How even the shape of the streets and different things in D.C. has some occultic meanings?
I have, yeah. I can't recount it in detail, but yeah, it's the overlay, even the Washington Monument,
yeah,
is an obelisk, and with ties to
Egypt,
Egyptian ties. Yep.
Yeah. What have you heard, Don, or do you recall?
I wish I could speak on that subject. I found that part fascinating. I remember seeing a movie. It was a Nicolas Cage movie, and I can't remember the name of it.
Oh, National Treasure?
National Treasure.
Yeah.
And that movie was just fantastic in that, showing all the old, things that maybe the Masons might have done, or all those kind of the secret things that might be in that city. And quite honestly, I mean, I would love all that to be, completely true, because that kind of stuff is just exciting, and it just kind of shows a depth of humans that is just, I guess we're as humans, we're pretty much limitless. And I think that God has to keep us kind of in check, as it was said back in Tower of Babel.
Nothing, they will be able to accomplish everything. Nothing will be, how does he put it? Nothing will be impossible for them, right? Yeah, I think that speaks to even the Watchers in giving technology to humanity that we were either never meant to have, or we were never meant to have, at least then. Like, it was way too much power for humanity to have. It's like giving a 16-year-old kid on his birthday a 900 horsepower supercar. Like, you're just asking for major trouble.
And I think part of the receiving of knowledge, and your example is spot on. It has to do with character. You don't give an immature individual certain things. Well, look at us as created beings, freshly created by God, Adam and Eve. We were holy. We were made in His image. But their character hadn't been tried yet. And, in order for God to allow free will to take place, both in the angelic sons of God and the humanity sons of God, there had to be an element of us failing. And without the chance to fail, you don't have a chance to prove your character.
Right.
And so that's kind of what this life is it's a chance to prove ourselves. In my opinion, we're called to be holy, we're called to be perfect, but we're never going to get to that without His grace, without His
that's
assistance.
why Scripture says lacking in nothing. That, what is it? The patience will lead to character, and so I know I'm butchering the verse, but so that you will lack for nothing. Yeah, He wants us to be mature.
So I almost feel like the knowledge that you're referring to, whether it's technology or these understandings of things, in the hands of the immature, the hands of those that haven't worked out holiness and has these character traits, it's a dangerous tool, because you're easily persuaded. Because what does it talk about with the flesh? The flesh has to be crucified. It can't be redeemed. Well, in our fallen state, maybe there was an opportunity for Adam and Eve to perfect themselves and get to a level where, okay, God could trust them. They achieved what they needed to achieve in maturity. Okay, now go eat of the tree of life and lock in that holiness that you have.
Oh,
But
right.
when they fell, they would have locked in the sinful
The
nature.
sinfulness. I think too. There's something to that too. If you look at how you're talking about, humanity not being tested yet, and we're kind of in our immature infancy, when we were first created. You look at kind of the ways that God set up laws. Very, very basic. Eye for an eye. Just really, really simple. It's just giving a structure. Because society was very uncivilized, and we had a lot to learn. So he's kind of laying that physical groundwork. And then later, of course, when Jesus comes, well, now he's upping the standard. Now it's about your heart. Now it's about your motivations. It's not just these outward sins, right?
There is definitely some simple things, but as I've dug into the Old Testament, it was almost to my mind that the Lord made it very obvious to humanity, to the Israelites, that you can't obtain this. If you just fail on one letter of the law, it's as if you failed in all of them. So it's pointing humanity towards a need. You don't need a savior unless you know you're lost.
Yep, that's what the law was designed to do as a schoolmaster to lead us to Christ. No, that's true. And even in the Old Testament, people think, well, how did people get saved in the Old Testament? It was the same way. It was faith. People don't realize it because you think in terms of the law, right? That was the covenant or whatever. But it was faith, and they knew full well they couldn't keep the law perfectly.
Yes, because it is recorded of Abraham was perfected by his faith.
Right. Yep. Even though he had some big failures of, that's recorded with how he treated his wife and lying about different things. I mean, some of these, the biggest names in faith in the Old Testament couldn't keep the law, and were pretty egregious sinners. But it was their faith. David, Moses, both were murderers.
Yeah.
So then we have talking about what was the ancients would have called the seven particular wandering stars. So the word planet didn't exist way back when. They were called wandering stars. And so the seven that Doug mentions are Jupiter, Saturn, Venus, Mars, Mercury, and then they also included the sun and the moon as part of them. And those were all worshipped as deities in the ancient world. And I thought it was really interesting, too, that Doug made this connection. So if you guys recall in Revelation, where Jesus is talking about the seven churches, and they each had kind of their own character flaws, their own issues. The bone to pick that Jesus had with each one of them was different, right?
Right.
And so it's really kind of fascinating. I don't have all the examples here, but so, for example, the church at Smyrna. Let's see here. Let me see if I can bring up the reference here. So you had Ephesus, Smyrna, Pergamum, Thyatira, Sardis, Philadelphia, and Laodicea. And so apparently every single one of these corresponds to something in the heavens and has something similar to it. So Smyrna was like the sun, which would be the largest, because I think that was in Ephesus, if I'm not mistaken, which was the largest. And then, let's see here. One of the cities was, the way Jesus describes them, was similar to how the moon waxes and wanes. Pergamum was like Mars, the god of war, and Jesus says, "I will war with you." Sardis corresponded to Mercury, the god of thieves, and I believe that's the section where Jesus says he'll come like a thief in the night. And then Jupiter was like the king's star, and so that was related to Philadelphia. Laodicea was to Saturn. Saturn was known for its sluggish motion. And so I think there's some language there that Jesus says about Laodicea being like a sluggard. So it's really fascinating how those things are all tied to, like, not to say that they were, ruled necessarily by these gods or something in the sky, but just kind of how that language ties in that Jesus used was something they would have connected to. And then even in Israel, the way the 12 tribes were laid out, they were laid out in accordance to the 12 constellations of the zodiac. And so again, we're not saying zodiac like astrology, horoscope, but this is where we get it from, that there's, constellations in the sky, and there's kind of these 12 chief areas. And I wish I had the reference in front of me, but Doug was talking about the different tribes. God said, okay, you encamp on this side of the tabernacle, you on the north, you on the south, and so on.
Let me ask you, Pete, just your opinion. If God was directing them, because he created the stars first, and then you got the history of humanity, and they're playing it out here on the planet, and he's directing these tribes to go into different. Why would he, in your opinion, have them line up with constellations? What do you think is in God's heart that would be important that they would line up with anything that's in the sky?
I'm not sure in terms of their specific orientation. That'd be something to look into more. But Doug does say that the tabernacle in the center is kind of symbolic of the sun in the center, and I think it's in Malachi, God being called the Son of Righteousness, S-U-N.
Unless it had something very practical, like, you give somebody a marching order, and then future generations might be like, what did God say? Oh, that constellation over here, I'm supposed to be in the Northwest. This is where my family sets up, because that's where God put me. It's like,
it may have to do with it may have to do with the division of tasks too. So let's see here. In Daniel, it says the saints will be like the stars of God, will take their place. And Paul says we will judge angels. So I wonder if there is a foreshadowing going on of, these rebellious angels, that we are taking their place in the divine council, as Mike Heiser says. And there may be a foreshadowing going on that God had his reason that made no sense and had virtually no meaning, perhaps, to the Hebrews back then, or Israel, but is a foreshadowing to how we are going to be reconciled into the family and judging angels. So there may be a tie in there. I'm speculating, but
yeah,
that's possible. All right, kind of moving on. So, yeah, I think what Doug said as far as that orientation was kind of the tabernacle as the dwelling place of God in the center, and kind of how it was laid out with them all around it. And so kind of that tabernacle and the 12 tribes as an exact opposite to the Tower of Babel. One thing too I've thought of too, guys. You ever thought of this, like how we call a celebrity a star? It's kind of interesting, isn't it? It's like idolatry, a god. Oh, you're a star. He or she is a star. I don't think I don't think it's coincidental. I don't know. I just think it's just one of those ways where it's tied into something false, right? I don't know. Just a thought.
Did anybody here read the entire series, the C.S. Lewis series about Narnia, Lion, the Witch, and Wardrobe? And
I stopped at the first one.
oh, gotcha. Well, the last book, and of course all the books build up to this last book. The last book is completely out of this world fantastic because it talks about the stars as being different entities that are placed there for a reason. There was one that was one part of the book that talked about rubies and diamonds as they come from the earth, and we look at them as neat treasures, but the people who were living deep in the earth, they were food and they were delicious. And by the time we got them, they were rotten and hard, and it just kind of so. And there in one of the books, there's I don't want to spoiler this, but one of the books was when they were underground doing some sort of an adventure, they found this giant old man sleeping. And in the last book, he comes into play. And so it's a fantastic series. And I'm not a reader, but I went through that series with some haste because
Wow.
I found it to be fantastic.
I might have to revisit that. And obviously, C.S. Lewis and Tolkien, they both kind of, it makes you wonder, did they talk and share? So you got the Lord of the Rings, and then you got the Narnia, and there's some similarities, but it's definitely different paths they take. And I don't know. You sparked my interest. I got to check that out.
Yeah, well, we had an old set of the Narnia books still around. I had it in the basement here that I inherited from Mom and Dad, and you're like I never went through more than the first one, but my daughter and I we've slowly been reading all the Little House on the Prairie books, and we just finished a couple months ago. So I'm like, well, what should we do next? Hey, let's do Narnia. And I'm looking at it with, like you guys, kind of with fresh eyes of, wow, this is how they actually saw the world. This wasn't just fantasy to them. They thought this was reality at some point, and it's kind of funny how Lewis will use these creatures and how he decides which ones are on the good side and which ones are on the bad side, because like he'll use the satyrs, the goat men on the good side, and you look at the history of satyrs and stuff, they're pretty deviant, evil beings. So it's just kind of funny how he picks.
You're exactly right. One of the first books of Chronicles of Narnia, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, the children, what was one of the first creatures they meet?
The fawn.
Which is almost like
I think it's a satyr,
like
right?
Pan.
Yeah, like Pan, exactly.
I mean, he was half human, and then had like a goat. He was a chimera, and it makes you wonder if we were to research just those two authors, what influenced them, spiritually or literally in what they read, to kind of come up with this. So it makes you wonder what question. Was their worldview or their biblical view, because we talk about on these shows what was the influence of the early Christians, and they had Mesopotamian influence. They had the Book of Enoch,
exactly,
and that type of stuff. It makes you wonder what these authors had as influences to motivate them.
Yeah. See, every time we do this, guys, we come up with 2 or 3 new ideas for shows. So we're never going to run out. That's a good thing. Yeah. And then the host, one of the hosts, Nate, on the show asked a good question. He was asking, are the gods put over the nations, are they meant to rule justly or poorly? And I would add to that, are they fallen angels at that point? Are they good angels? And I think that ties back into Deuteronomy 32, where Mike Heiser goes into great detail about this in Unseen Realm, but this idea that the nations were given gods over them, and God took Israel for himself, but then I believe there was like 70 other nations that each had kind of a angelic divine ruler put over them as kind of a punishment, it seems. And that's, if you look at that verse, some texts say the son, according to the sons of Israel, but that's actually incorrect because Israel wasn't formed yet, which I think is from the Masoretic, but then other texts will say sons of gods, and it makes a lot more sense in that context. But yeah, kind of wondering, like, okay, we've talked a little bit about when did Satan fall. We don't have anything in the Bible other than Revelation 12 about other divine beings rebelling. So perhaps that didn't happen in the Garden of Eden or before. You know, maybe it was the sin of the Watchers or something after that happened. Because if we get to Deuteronomy 32, it seems like these gods are fallen. These angels are not good. Because remember, Daniel, he's praying, right? And angel finally shows up 3 weeks later and says, I was delayed by the prince of Persia. I had to get Michael to help me fight him. So this prince of Persia was some divine entity that was warring against a good angel. Okay, well, when did he fall? Was it this Deuteronomy 32 event that God placed these beings over these nations? Well, they would have been, you know, it wasn't like God saying, okay, you're going to be a bad guy now. Okay, I'm writing the script. You were a good guy, now you're a bad guy. You're the Prince of Persia. No, I think they would have fallen before that, but when is kind of my question.
My thinking is the fall took place all at once. So the timing of the third of the angels and Lucifer being the chief, they all fell at the same time. And it was like they got kicked out of the third heaven. That is where God's presence is. That's where God's throne is. And so they occupied, well, one thing we definitely don't know, and I know Tim Alberino likes to speculate some of the scriptures that there was this world planetarium, like a planetary type battle.
Yeah, you know? Pre-Adamic.
Yeah. He looks at Earth, that it was already created, but it was in this judgment state, you know. So my mind is kind of like the angels are already out of the third heaven. They're occupying maybe this planet during its after the battle type of sequence, you know, before the creation of man. And they're also occupying the second heavens. So when the creation of Adam and Eve took place, Lucifer was already fallen. He's observing God do this rebirth, and in my mind, they're already there, and then as humanity grows and God says, "Be fruitful and multiply," He takes the opportunity to influence and to disrupt God's plan with humanity, just over and over and over again. That's kind of how I envision it. So they physically came to Earth, but they're also occupying the second heavens, which is documented in Daniel, where if an angel is coming from third heaven trying to get to Earth, which you could call first heaven, he's got to go through that realm that is occupied by the enemy.
Okay.
And there's how do angels war? I don't know, but there was definitely a delay documented. So I don't know. That's kind of how
That's an interesting thought. I'm challenged by what, you know, Mike Heiser and Doug Van Dorn have talked about, that there's no verse in the Bible other than Revelation 12 that we have this idea of other angels. So the stars being a third of the stars being swept by the dragon's tail. We don't have that anywhere except until Revelation. And Revelation 12, according to them, is connected to the timing of Messiah's birth. So that's where I start scratching my head and I go, I don't know when these other angels would have fallen, because if it's connected to the birth of the Messiah, they would not have fallen, at least the third of them anyway, maybe some smaller number. They would not have fallen until the time of Jesus' birth. So, yeah.
But that timeline doesn't fit in my thinking and my understanding of the scripture.
Okay.
Because we just said it with Daniel, it wasn't just Lucifer himself that is warring against Michael. There was other.
We know the sin of the Watchers. So according to Enoch, there were 200. Go ahead, Don.
I'm going to have to jet. Sorry, I'm sending my daughter off to the Dells with a friend. So
no problem. Thanks for hopping in. Appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, man. All right. Happy New Year.
Happy New Year.
Happy New Year. Yep.
All right. Bye-bye. Yeah, so we know we had the 200 Watchers according to Enoch, and possibly more after the fact. So I'm kind of wondering if it was these sons of God, one of the higher ranking ones that were put over these nations. I don't know. Is there a particular scripture that's coming to mind?
Not really.
Okay.
I just when Revelation is speaking of the third being swept, I believe that the Lord is making reference to what took place before creation.
Okay.
I don't believe it's an event that's yet to come. I believe it took place in time past. And then if you look up the scripture that's describing Lucifer and his fall, I think it's in the prophets, maybe Isaiah.
Ezekiel. Yep.
Yep. So he definitely wasn't the only one that fell. As far as what I've heard commentators and pastors preach. So my kind of thinking was during the time of the Watchers and during the time, is it possible that there was a third, along with Lucifer, of the angels that fell, and maybe God assigned some heavenly hosts, some angels, in a position of a watcher, whatever that assignment is. So they were kind of overseers of humanity as they're being fruitful and multiplying. And they were, in addition, they fell, as we know, and then were locked up in everlasting chains, or at least until the appointed time of their release. It's possible that those 200 were in addition to Lucifer and the third of heaven, of the angelic fallen.
Yeah, that's possible. I guess where I'm leaning towards is the third wasn't until Messiah's birth, but there were others.
That seems like too late.
Yeah,
in my mind.
I don't know. I guess we're.
So if the third of heaven doesn't fall until the time of Messiah's birth,
mm-hmm.
who would be hindering Michael from answering?
Yeah, so
Daniel?
I'm with you on the path that there would have been others that fell. We have this rebel in the Garden of Eden, the serpent. We have the 200 Watchers, and it's hinted at least that other incursions could have taken place. So I think it has to do with something there. Look at Tower of Babel. They were obviously trying to get in touch with beings that, if they were good angels, they would not be enticing mankind to get their worship, to give them power, and so on. So there was some sort of divine connection to bad beings. And again, we want to make the distinction that they weren't demons, because demons were the fallen spirits of the disembodied spirits, rather, of the giants after the giants died, and those are bound to earth. So we're talking about something on more the angelic level in the heavens, like you said. So I'm with you that there's some other fall. I just don't know if it's like a full third until later on. But we'll kind of table that for now and come back to it maybe with some more research, because that's a tricky one. But you're right. It goes against everything. Like we kind of, our tradition is that a third of the angels rebelled with Lucifer. We just kind of think of that as in eternity past that happened. So kind of going back to this concept of counterfeit versus real. I talked about kind of how something even real and true can still be counterfeit depending on our focus, our emphasis on it. It was interesting. I think it was a video that Rob Skiba did, where he showed that you can use equations in math to work out to something that is actually false, but mathematically it's true. And I've been trying to find this video, but it's really fascinating. So he said, okay, you know the cliche glass half empty, glass half full, right? They're the same.
Right.
They're the same thing. And he proved it mathematically with correct math that the glass half full or half empty, either way, actually had nothing in it. And it was like, what? So we know we can look at a half full glass and go, obviously it's got something in it, besides air. But he proved it mathematically that it actually was empty, and it was something like 0.5, half times 0 or something like that. Well, what's the answer? 0. But it was more convoluted than that. And that makes me think of so Tesla had a really good quote, and of course we know how ahead of his time he was. But let me find this quote here. So, and again, this was back in his day, 100 years ago or something? He said, today's scientists have substituted mathematics for experiments, and they wander off through equation after equation and eventually build a structure which has no relation to reality. And I think of some of these famous astrophysicists like Michio Kaku and what's the other guy? I forget. Anyway, just this idea that they can be correct mathematically, but if their basis isn't in reality, then it can be completely false. So I think that's just another way that a counterfeit religion can come into being, is that it appears correct.
If you're one of the first ones that create or understand the math, you got to look at it from so many different angles, and I might solve it and think I'm right, and then someone goes back and well, you didn't. It's like, who says that it's wrong versus right, and how do you learn to check it from different ways? Just
I don't know. That's just like, well, there's so many rules, and it's supposed to be precise. So that's where 2 + 2 should always be 4. But I've seen it
does seem to be fluid.
I've seen math professors, actual college, university math professors, do videos on how it's not always 4, and they get around it using math. So it does get confusing. That's kind of a rabbit hole. But
did you ever seen the movie Beautiful Mind?
Oh yeah, I have that.
And there's he's racking his brain because he's trying to come up with something so cutting edge, and it's mathematical in his logic, but something that's never been done before. And then you got to be able to. It's almost like science. You got different hypotheses, and then you got to
test them.
You got to test it. You got to prove it, and then if you come up with something that you think works, and you present it. It's almost like a peer review process. You present it to other professionals, and then they analyze it, And if everybody checks the box and is like, we agree, then it moves on and it becomes a truth.
I think it's it's an ever evolving, just like math and science. They're ever evolving. You can't say something is necessarily settled. And I think it's amazing how mathematical God made the universe, because if you just Google or go on YouTube and look up fractals, and how there's never-ending patterns in things like at microscopic levels. And then we've talked a little bit about cymatics, that every frequency has its own geometric, symmetrical pattern built into frequencies. There's an incredible amount of reality that God built into that. But another thought that I've had over the years is, you think about some of these superhero movies, Star Wars or Marvel series, and inevitably what happens when these beings or these heroes have this much power. Like, you think about humanity and our selfishness, right? How would that not be inviting worship of the self and others wanting to emulate them and so on and so forth? And I just think it's just so wise of God to, if you have some movie where, we've got to capture this stone or this sword or whatever, because if the dark side gets it, then they'll have all the power. And it's just so wise.
The ring.
The ring. It's like so wise of God to say, no, I'm not gonna create this kind of stuff, because all you would do with it is it would be about the self. It'd be like Thor with his hammer, and people would be like, "Oh wow, look at Thor!" And that's exactly what happened. That's what we're saying. What happened, right? That people were worshiping these gods.
Referencing.
Yeah,
I think that's what I was referencing earlier. It's not that God won't allow us to have it. He's got to be able to trust us.
Right. We couldn't handle
it. And you could even go into the realm of charismatic circles of the church, where they're seeking signs and wonders and miracles. And I think those are all biblical things that we should be declaring and wanting. The Book of Acts type of stuff taking place today. But what did Paul say? If you have all these things and the ability to prophesy and all this stuff, but you don't have character, you don't have love, it profits nothing. So you got to have the foundation first before you can have these extra things. God's got to be able to trust us,
right?
And I think that's what the enemy definitely did with all this influence that he did across the world. He dangled all these things, and people were enticed by the knowledge. They were enticed by the power. They were enticed by just the depth of, because it expanded their brains, because they had no concept when it came to the mathematics and the stars and all these different sciences and stuff. It had to have been taught to them. And as we know from the book Enoch, it was a quid pro quo, it was a give and it was a take. I will give you this if you give me the daughters. Right.
Well, one of the technologies is, makeup. And you think, well, what's wrong with that? Well, so again, it was them not being able to be trusted with that knowledge, and it enhanced the seduction and so on that was going on. So yeah, it was arts that we today would think there's nothing inherently wrong to it, but it's like you said, being able to trust us with it in our kind of our infancy of our human history. It comes down to stealing worship that belongs to God. That the gods are really the creators, right? That man is the measure of all things. We make our own rules. We become the stars. We become the gods. Just lost my train of thought. I'll come back. Yeah, so that the gods are really the creators. Just that counterfeit idea that we say is likely going to come in the end times, where some alien incursion, or the gods come back and say, we are really your creators. It's all about that counterfeit, or like we talked about with Michael Tellinger, where he was saying the Anunnaki created humanity as slaves. So this is all like Sumerian, Mesopotamian stories that are a counterfeit history to the biblical narrative, the book of Enoch, even though they kind of draw upon one another. So here's a thought I've been thinking about too this week. So creation, right? It's meant to give God glory, but often ends up seeking its own glory. So I had a question. Why didn't God just make creation less glorious? And so there would be less allure, less temptation, right? See, I mean, you think about it, like some of the most powerful influences in the world, possessions, power, sex, all these things, they could actually be twice or 10 times more powerful to our emotions. Well, God made it however powerful he made it to us. But you kind of think, well, why not just make it less so it's less attractive? But then I thought,
people blame God, and there's even, I'm kind of vaguely thinking of a comedian that kind of is picking on God. It's like, you want me to be holy, but yet you gave me the sexual urge. You made all these beautiful women that entice me, and just like, why are you trying to trick me like this? Why are you torturing me like this?
Mm-hmm.
But that is not how God created it, because we're in a fallen state. So you have to look at it in the completeness of it. Yeah, I think in the end, it's God that he did it for his own glory. He created sex for his own purpose, but also because he loves us. He wanted it to be pleasurable. He created all these beautiful things of creation. Yeah, it's enticing, but if we have the right heart and we keep him first, it enhances our life. Being able to taste food, all these different things.
Yeah, enjoy food, not just keep you alive. Yeah, but then so I kind of answered that question as I was thinking about it, that if things were less powerful around us, less attractive, whatever, then it would detract from the meaning and power when we choose to give him glory above all things. Then we're truly making a sacrifice for obedience to him. So if there was this, if like choosing the path God wants for us wasn't much of a sacrifice because the other things weren't that great, like eating a stale cracker, like, okay, it's food, but it's not that great. Well, it's not much of a sacrifice then if we follow him. So in the same way we say, God didn't make robots, he gave us free will. If he made us to love him and not sin as a robotic, locked in frozen state, well, that's not real love. So maybe by the same token, he didn't want to dumb down all of these good gifts of the world, because it wouldn't mean much, if we were to follow God. I was going to add, too, that Tim Abarino says that God has a free will also. And that's interesting, which is why we have to have it, because we're made in his image. That's kind of mind-blowing that God has a free will. And you're like, well, he's kind of locked in his nature. He doesn't change.
Look at it, the story of, or the interaction that's documented in the Old Testament between God and Moses. God had purposed to wipe out humanity and start over. And then there's this interaction between Moses and God, so it was like he had a free will, a choice. He wanted to do this, unless God in his wisdom, being Alpha and Omega, knowing what Moses was going to do, it was a test. It's like, I'm going to play like I'm going to destroy everything, and I'm going to see how you respond. and he was happy. He was he passed the test, because here Moses is being the leader that God called him to be, and uh, uh, he's interceding on their behalf,
Right.
and God, part of his character is merciful. So I don't know. It's kind of interesting to think that
It is, and it's almost like a divine counsel moment too, where God got to let him be a part of the decision, right? And that kind of leads me to, kind of this idea of God's omnipotence, which he is. It means all powerful. But my opinion, and it seems like, reality and scripture bears this out, all powerful does not mean that he can do anything. And it seems like a non sequitur, like that doesn't follow. But really, think about this. It's because of a few things. Number one, he can't change, right? His nature stays the same. So that's something he can't do. He can't go against his own nature. He can't violate rules that he set up already for creation. Like we've talked about, the mankind having dominion over the earth. Jesus saying, I couldn't do many miracles because of lack of faith. So he's set up cosmic rules about how things work, and he literally can't break those rules. So I've often thought, why doesn't God just snap his fingers? Like, have you seen all the Marvel movies, Luke? Where is it? Thanos?
No, but
okay. So there's a really powerful character who he's going to get these stones, and if he gets all the stones, then all he has to do is snap his fingers and think a thought, and it will happen. So he wants to wipe out half of all the beings in the universe and start fresh with the other half. And so I've often wondered, why doesn't God, why does he allow Satan to have so much influence? And here we are suffering year after year with demons running around and all this stuff that he could just, he's God, he could just wipe it out, right? And it makes you think he's got some cosmic rules that he set up. These beings are allowed to have a certain measure of authority, right? And it's because of the rules that he set up that he's going to play by them.
Yeah, I've heard Pastor Doug Riggs talk about that when he's ministering and exposed to the probably the most inhumane aspects of the enemy and also humanity working together, and he had to grow what he describes as his God box, and really understand. It's like, okay, how does God allow this, and how does God tolerate it, and how is God using it for his purpose, even though he didn't cause it? The responsibility is on the individual and on the enemy. And, God is not to be mocked. They will reap what they sow. And so it does, I think it requires us to grow in our understanding of the Lord. And we got a finite human mindset here in this body. But I think as we grow in the Lord, we can come to understand a little bit more on what he's trying to accomplish.
I think God's too also an idealist, and he's also, obviously incredibly genuine and authentic. And if he's going to give his creation a measure of free will, of power, of control over different things, he's not going to interfere with those things. He's going to let them play out in the ways that he's set up. And I think that lends towards the authenticity of it, because if he were to change the rules mid-game, oh, okay, God, right, you're just cheating. Of course he could do that because he's God, but it wouldn't mean as much. If you could change the rules in the middle of the Super Bowl and then win, it doesn't mean so much.
And I think that's a good point to emphasize, because if the fall of Lucifer and the third of the angels took place before creation of man, and the rules were already in place before that took place. I feel like the enemy, in his wisdom, knows the rules.
Oh, definitely. Yeah.
And I mean, the interaction between Lucifer and Job, or Lucifer and God on behalf of Job, he understood some of these rules. And you're right. I think if God was to change the rules, Lucifer would call him out on it. And he might, and maybe wouldn't have the sentence or the judgment pending against him. I mean, why was it that God allowed the iniquity to reach fullness? It's described of, I think, in the Promised Land.
Yeah, the Amorites.
With the Amorites,
Yep.
the iniquity of the Amorites to reach. That's kind of a puzzling thing, unless almost like, and Don's a detective. It would be nice to hear his perspective on this. How a detective or a prosecutor or someone that's building a case against, you're watching, you're observing, you're seeing this criminal activity take place, but you choose not to bust them at that second. You're waiting for, as we see in the crime shows, you don't want to slap on their wrist for, if you got a big mob boss, you don't want to just bust them on a misdemeanor. You want to get them on the biggest felony charge, murder charge, the thing that's going to put them away for good.
Yeah, you don't want to get the lower level guy.
And if you allow it to build, the iniquity to build to a certain point, they're incriminating themselves. Pastor Doug Rigg calls it the Lucifer's caught in a double bind. And then you can throw the book at him.
Yep. Yeah. And it's interesting too. So I'm getting towards the end of the first Narnia book, going back to that. And here you have the White Witch talking to Aslan. Of course, Aslan is the Jesus prototype or archetype. And she says, look, the law says that if there is a traitor, and that was Edmund who betrayed his brothers and sisters, that I get to take blood. And that's why, see, I forgot about this. I've seen the movies, that's why he makes the transaction to give himself, because by rights, she had authority to take a life. And so he spared Edmund and took his place, just like Christ on the cross for us. I thought that was fascinating reading it in the book just last night, because not only is it perfect, obviously it's an allegory of the gospel, but what a perfect picture that God has cosmic rules in place. And he's not going to violate those rules, even if it means evil gets to triumph for a season. But ultimately, he is going to win. He is going to show himself glorious. He's going to let things play out, evil and humanity in their rebellion. He's going to let it play out, because ultimately it's that contrast between good and evil that shows how good he is, that we probably wouldn't see without it. Right.
And back to kind of the overall theme of this is, talking about the counterfeit. We have to understand, when the enemy tries to counterfeit something, we have to remember that, there's something authentic, that God had put in place, and not to be distracted by all the confusion, because he's the author of confusion, by all these counterfeits. And it seems like, things aren't clear. I don't know. It's just get back on right focus.
Yeah, I've heard it. I've heard it said that when a law enforcement or FBI agent is trained on counterfeit money, how to spot it, they don't look at all of the fakes. They study the real thing. And they notice every detail about the real thing, because then you can spot every fake. You just compare it to that.
Okay.
So you start there with the real thing, and then you can spot everything else. But if you start with a fake and it looks pretty good, you could definitely be convinced, hey, this is real. And it would make a lot of sense. And I think that's kind of how the blindness of the world is, before we come to understanding God as the creator and our savior and our friend, is that we don't see it clearly, and what we see as reality looks real, and it's ultimately not. Well, that's a great place to end for now. There's some more stuff that was in the episode that we can get to next time. I wanted to kind of get into Doug's view of millennialism, of the Christ millennial reign, which he has a kind of unique take on that. But I think that'd be a good topic in and of itself to go into. So we will save that for another time.
Sounds good.
All right, man. Good discussion. We'll see you next time, and Happy New Year.
Happy New Year.
You've been listening to the Days of Noah podcast. Thanks for tuning in. Please give us a positive review, a thumbs up, share with your friends and family. I really appreciate all of your support in that way. It really helps to get this podcast out to more people. So thanks for your support, and thanks for tuning in. Join us next time.